Marijuana Jiu-Jitsu, using the adverse effects of alcohol to our advantage. One would think that marijuana legalization advocates would enthusiastically embrace the pot versus alcohol comparison. After all, when one steps back and objectively evaluates the potential risks of pot and booze, marijuana's side effects are relatively insignificant. Nevertheless, some advocates have been hesitant to make direct comparisons between the two substances, fearing that discussions about the harms of alcohol will only serve to remind the public that marijuana might pose similar detrimental effects. Others have been reluctant to position cannabis as a less harmful alternative to alcohol, assuming that making such a comparison might appear as if they are promoting marijuana use. Interestingly, the same advocates who shy away from comparing the effects of pot to the effects of alcohol typically do not hesitate to compare marijuana prohibition to alcohol prohibition. Listen to almost any speech by a prominent drug policy reformer, and you are likely to hear a reference to the failure of America's so-called noble experiment. The purpose is to remind the audience that the federal prohibition of alcohol did not stamp out alcohol use. Rather, it significantly increased the crime associated with alcohol and drove its use underground, where the lack of regulations made its consumption more dangerous. Yet, when reformers make this comparison, they downplay that the use of alcohol increased once prohibition ended. Their goal is simply to convince the audience that prohibition is counterproductive, and since it was deemed a failure for alcohol, it should also be deemed a failure for marijuana. Of course, whether it is emphasized or not, most everyone in the audience will assume that ending marijuana prohibition would increase the availability and use of cannabis, perhaps significantly. If this audience is made up of individuals already familiar with the relative harms of marijuana and alcohol, then the likely prospect of an increase in the public's use of pot will not necessarily be much of a concern to them. But if those listening believe that cannabis is potentially as harmful as alcohol, which is what most swing voters who will ultimately decide whether marijuana should be legal in the future are likely to believe, they will not be thrilled by the prospect of marijuana storefronts opening up in their neighborhoods. When you consider this fact, it becomes almost shocking that any advocate would intentionally avoid educating the public that marijuana has been proven to be less harmful than alcohol. Instead of avoiding comparisons between pot and booze, we propose that proponents of marijuana legalization engage in some verbal jiu-jitsu. Jiu-jitsu is a fighting technique involving the use of balance and leverage to turn your opponent's strength and momentum to your own advantage. As things stand today, Americans' concern over the ill effects of alcohol, as exhibited by the question, "Why add another vice?" is a force against marijuana policy reform. Advocates for cannabis regulation want the public to accept legalization despite the fact that a substantial portion of the public considers marijuana to be at least as dangerous as alcohol. In short, reformers are calling for a society where adults will have legal access to alcohol and marijuana at a time when the public is becoming increasingly aware of the health and societal problems associated with booze. This is an uphill task, to say the least. Sure, it may be possible to legalize marijuana despite this sentiment, but it will not be easy. In order to turn the tide after more than 70 years of marijuana propaganda and prohibition, the American people must be inspired to change the status quo. But if they believe, or are allowed to continue to believe, that the legal access to cannabis for adults will only compound many of the alcohol-fueled problems our society already faces, they will support keeping the system the way it is. This is where we need to apply our jiu-jitsu. We will take our opponent's strongest argument, that alcohol is associated with a wide variety of social ills, and twist it to our advantage. How will we do this? By responding to our critics over and over again that we are not seeking to add a vice. Instead, we are providing adults with a safer and less harmful recreational alternative to alcohol. In sum, the fact that alcohol causes so many problems in our society is not a reason to keep pot illegal. Rather, it is the reason we must make it legal. Unless our opponents are going to argue for a return to alcohol prohibition, they will be forced to explain why they wish to compel adults to use the more harmful recreational intoxicant.